Hello and welcome to EURACTIV's Beyond the Byline podcast. I am Georgi, and this week we are talking about the EU membership candidates, the progress made and the silence coming from the EU side. What is the instrument for pre-accession assistance and why is there a special process to join the bloc from the Western Balkans? We are also talking about how and if diplomacy can be the solution to the war in Ukraine. Diplomats from Ukraine and Russia met in Istanbul for another round of negotiations without an important outcome. Is the war in Ukraine one of the darkest hours for international diplomacy? Now, the invasion in Ukraine has been quite awakening for the EU and the candidates for the EU membership. We did see some new candidates, such as Ukraine, for obvious reasons, of course, and Moldova and Georgia wanting to join the bloc. And at the same time, we heard the voices coming from other countries, especially countries from the Western Balkans, which have been waiting for decades now to join the bloc. To hear more on this, I talked to EURACTIV's Vladislav Maximov. Welcome to the podcast, Vlad. Just to offer some context first, where are we at with the enlargement?
Well, as one very wise man suggested I tell you today, enlargement is dead. As we all know, the last enlargement happened with Croatia joining the bloc almost a decade ago. But to be completely honest with you, there's been very little movement for the rest of the Western Balkan Six. Serbia and Montenegro, who are supposedly the frontrunners of the process, are years and years away from joining. The steady deterioration of democratic standards in Serbia under President Aleksandar Vučić suggests that Serbia might be drifting farther away, not closer to the EU. In Montenegro, it's a highly unstable situation. North Macedonia and Albania are waiting for the Bulgarian veto to be resolved. Kosovo can't even get visa-free status, and Bosnia is not a candidate yet. So it's all very complex. And obviously, you might have been reading the headlines about Bosnia that the Serb leader is essentially threatening succession, and the entire country is unstable for way too many reasons. So this is the situation with the classic enlargement, so to say. Now, your question about Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia. Well, both Ukraine and Georgia have essentially written into their constitution that the Euro integration is the ultimate goal of both countries, and Moldova has expressed its wish to join the EU. In the case of Georgia, Georgia has even said that they were planning to submit their EU application, sort of launch the process in 2024. And Ukraine was planning to eventually join as well. But all of this has been pushed forward in a way. Ukraine, on the background of the war with Russia, was the first, and Georgia and Moldova followed suit. Now, from a strategic perspective, this makes sense. It is very hard for EU countries now to say no to Ukraine. On the one hand, on the other hand, saying yes to Ukraine means sending a message in a way to all these other countries in the region. Well, proponents of Ukraine will say all of this doesn't matter because candidate status is a symbolic thing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yes and no. Neither Bosnia nor Kosovo have been granted candidate status. So yes, of course, it's a symbolic gesture because there are a lot of steps along the road. But the reality of the situation is that it is a symbolic gesture, but it will also be a symbolic gesture to Bosnia and Kosovo, who have been promised membership in the EU explicitly a long time ago.
And Vlad, there is this instrument for pre-accession assistance. Does that mean that all candidate countries, with Ukraine included, of course, will have access to this assistance, whatever this assistance entails?
So the instrument for pre-accession assistance, the so-called IPA, is in its third generation now. It's IPA 3. And so if Ukraine was going to get candidate status, potentially they could qualify for it. However, we have to remember that that money is well along the road of already being budgeted, and candidate countries are already applying. Unlike in previous iterations of EPA, there are no country envelopes, so there is no preset amount that each country would get. The funding is allocated based on priorities and the projects. So in theory, if Ukraine was going to get candidate status, I guess, and do not, this is going out in the public, but don't quote me on this. I guess in theory, Ukraine could access this assistance, but a lot that money already sort of has a place. So the Commission has been touting its investment plan for the Western Balkans, and the vast majority of that will be actually financed from EPA 3. That plan is supposed to spend like 9 billion euros, but the Commission is promising that it will mobilize 30 billion altogether, which would represent a huge percentage of the region's GDP. But those promises are need to materialize. It's unclear that the EU will actually be able to mobilize that much money. And when they say mobilize, what does this mean? It means that by investing into the region 9 billion, they are hoping that it will generate, by attracting private investors, institutional investors. When they say institutional investors, we primarily mean international development banks. So they hope that by putting 9 billion into the Western Balkans, they will be able to generate another 30 billion put into the Western Balkans, which would be a significant amount of money. Now, these promises, you can either believe them or not, and it depends on the competence of the Commission, but also in the economic climate at the time this investment will be happening. But that is the estimate of the Commission. Now, going back to your question, whether Ukraine will be able to access this money, yes, sure, in theory. However, as I said, that money already sort of has a place. And increasing envelopes, as you know, between different programming periods is next to impossible. And now you can understand that Ukraine's candidate status is, yes, a symbolic question, but also a logistical question or a budgetary question for a lot of people down the line. However, I need to emphasize this is not what people primarily are thinking about now. I don't think this is at the forefront of everyone's thinking of, well, if Ukraine gets candidate status, then it will be taking money away from the Western Balkans.
Remaining to the Western Balkans, apparently there is a special process for the Western Balkans to join the bloc. What does the EU mean by special, and why do we even have a special process for the Balkans?
The answer to your question is complex, just as the Western Balkans region. But essentially it goes back to in some ways to the 90s, but most easy to pinpoint is the Thessaloniki Declaration. This is from 2003, if I remember correctly. And this is the moment where essentially the EU said to Western Balkan countries, which, remember, at that point, it included other countries that has since become members of the EU, most notably Croatia, that one day you will be members of the bloc, one way or another. So this is sort of the special status of the Western Balkans, is that this promise has already been made and not delivered on. And in the meantime, it's been 20 years. This is why we're talking about decades of enlargement in the Western Balkans. In 20 years, we have not been able to achieve that. With the notable exception of Croatia. And so the question then becomes, if we don't have the special process working for the region that we say is the priority for the bloc, and we say whose future lies in the EU, then how can we possibly make that promise to anyone else currently? This is sort of the thinking. And you also have to keep in mind that the credibility of the enlargement in the region is today probably the lowest it's ever been. And there's always a different explanation for why that is. It can be migration crisis, it can be Brexit, it can be COVID, it's now Russia's invasion. But essentially, it always looks like there's a reason why the EU is unable to deliver on its promise. There always seems to be an excuse. Now, this is not to say that the countries in the Western Balkans are ready to become part of the EU. We perfectly know that there are very deep systemic issues there, but the argument goes, well, are we really paying enough attention? Are we really paying enough attention, money, and support to the Western Balkans? Now, well, partially we have a special process because the process has been going on for so long. We keep making promises again and again and again and again. That is why it's very special. And the other candidate is, of course, Turkey, and we know that Turkey has drifted away in terms of democratic standards, at least in the EU's eyes.
And do you think that we will keep hearing these voices coming from the Western Balkans? Do you think enlargement will be one of the topics of the EU agenda? Or do you think the agenda has completely shifted right now?
It's going to stay on the agenda. Of course it will, because would be politically suicidal and very destructive for the region. To say what the French have been suggesting a couple of years ago is that, we need to stop the process and rethink the entire situation from ground up. That would cause a lot of instability. There are also some indications that there's continued thought about the Western Balkans. The German Chancellor Scholz just a couple of days ago said, we need to speed up the process for the Balkans in light of the war. That will give a new impetus. But as always with the enlargement, the ultimate will and the speed at which the process moves will lie with the member states. And unless there is understanding across European capitals that the status quo of enlargement may seem like a good outcome, now it is actually quite untenable in the long run and will lead to complete economic and social devastation of the Western Balkans. One thing to keep in mind that there's been a massive emigration from the region towards the EU. I mean, in some countries, it really is just staggering, particularly in Bosnia. So the question becomes, well, who are we going to enlarge to when so many of the young brains are already in the EU? So, as following up on your question, whether enlargement will go to the background, well, in some ways it might not. There should be an incentive to bring it forward, as some of the politicians have been saying, because clearly we now see that there is a gaping hole in the European fabric, in a geopolitical situation where now we face a Moscow that is, at the very least, we know for a fact, is willing to militarily pursue its goals on the EU's borders. So in theory, enlargement should become all the more important. Now it remains to see whether it's going to be more declarations and more resolutions without any substance to back those things up.
Well, thank you, Vlad. You're listening to EURACTIV's Beyond the Byline podcast. Subscribe to our podcast newsletter on euractiv.com/newsletters. And if you want to expand your knowledge on other fields, you can listen to our Digital Brief podcast and Agri-Food Brief podcast. And moving to another topic, a bit more diplomatic this time, we wanted to look at how and if diplomacy can be the solution to the war in Ukraine. And to see how Russia and Ukraine can find compromise via diplomacy, I talked with EURACTIV's senior editor, Georgi Gotev. Georgi, how and can diplomacy be the solution to the war in Ukraine? What's your take on it?
Of course, diplomacy is important. I think what is needs to be clear is that the Russian army is in difficulty, militarily speaking, in Ukraine. Or in other words, Putin has miscalculated and he risks losing this war. And for him, this will be the end of his political career, if not worse. Mm-hmm. So Putin needs an exit strategy, and I hope via diplomatic means. A round of talks took place in Istanbul on Tuesday, 29 March. It marked some progress in negotiations. Now what remains to be seen is whether at a higher level this progress will be confirmed. It's difficult to guess.
So yeah, as you mentioned, this past week, diplomats met in Turkey, trying to negotiate for both sides, for Ukraine and Russia. Now, on the one hand, we have Russia saying that it wants to refocus its invasion efforts to consolidate ground held in the east of the country, in the predominantly Russian-speaking Donbas region. However, Ukrainian forces have started to regain ground in several key towns, giving them some possible leverage for diplomatic talks. How could these two parts try to find a compromise via the diplomatic road?
If we discuss the territorial question, Russia would certainly like to retain the Donbas region, but possibly more. And this is why fighting is raging at the key city of Mariupol. Russia would like to have a link to Crimea. And of course, part of the future territorial agreement would be the recognition by Ukraine of the annexation of Crimea. But what is certain is that Russia no longer aims at the whole of Ukraine. It doesn't aim at taking the capital Kiev, for example. It also means that Russia has abandoned his objective of, regime change. They call it denazification, whatever. But it looks like this is no longer the objective. And I think that an important basis for an agreement for the territorial issues is that Ukraine apparently has abandoned its ambition to join NATO. By the way, this ambition is enshrined in its constitution, so they will need to change it. And this will be done against some system of protection by international guarantors such as Turkey, France, Germany, the UK, and others. So it's even more complicated when we look at the political aspects, but who knows, maybe there is progress.
Now, Zelensky said that compromise might be possible over the complex issue of Donbas. What does he mean by that?
Well, it's not clear how much of Donbas Ukraine is ready to leave to Russia, because the separatists and now the Russian army, they do not control even half of the administrative regions of Donetsk and Lugansk. Russia probably wants the whole of the two regions, so it's going to be complicated.
And Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov tempered expectations, pointing to the lack of significant progress in the negotiations so far. Now, this coming Friday, there will be another round of negotiations. What can we expect, and is Putin really interested in a diplomatic solution to this war?
Well, regarding the comments by Peskov, Russia always plays the good cop, bad cop game. And by the way, the talks held in Istanbul were at rather low level. And this makes it very easy for Moscow to ignore the progress made at a higher level, if they want. But yes, it is in Putin's interest to have a diplomatic solution because a military solution doesn't seem to be a realistic choice unless he uses weapons of mass destruction, which would be a huge tragedy for mankind.
And while focusing on diplomacy, why is Turkey the perfect mediator for the talks between Ukraine and Russia? What's Erdogan's role in this?
Well, I cannot say if Turkey is the perfect mediator, but they succeeded to organize 2 rounds of talks so far. By the way, these are not the only talks. There are talks held in Belarus as well. But let's call them the first talks with an international mediator which is close to the Western community. And let's not forget that Turkey is a NATO member. Mm-hmm. So they succeeded to do that. Turkey is interested to be a player because Erdogan's ambition is to take part in the reconstruction of Ukraine after the war. And we can imagine that this reconstruction will be mostly paid by EU money. Mm-hmm. And Turkish firms are preparing to win the tenders. Mm-hmm. By the way, they are good, so why not? And the ailing Turkish economy badly needs the money.
Many countries, such as Belgium and the Netherlands, are expelling Russian diplomats from their territories. Why is this happening, and is this a dark hour for diplomacy in general?
Dark hour for diplomacy. It's in general, war is terrible because it means that diplomacy has failed. If we have war, it means diplomacy has failed. But it's also common knowledge that many of the Russian diplomats abroad are spies under diplomatic cover. And maybe for the West, it's better to stop closing its eyes and getting rid of people who undermine our societies. As simple as that.
Thank you very much, Georgi. And our time is up for this week. I am Evikiori, and this was EURACTIV's Beyond the Byline podcast. We will be back on your feed next week. Until then, subscribe to our podcast newsletter and visit EURACTIV.com for the latest news. And don't forget to listen to this podcast on your favorite podcast app. Thank you very much for listening.